So welcome to today's webinar on using the practice test. We're using a new Zoom feature to present webinars, and so in order to avoid any noise from participants' phones and computers, please make sure that yours is muted and that your camera is turned off. To do that, you would hover over the bottom left-hand side of your screen and click mute and stop video. And then once you've turned it off, you should see the visual shown with the red lines through it. All right, this webinar is being recorded and it will be linked in the practice test library later in the month. We'll also rerun this exact same webinar on October 16th and again in January when the 3 through 8 practice tests go live for students. So one of the most important things that we want to talk about with the practice tests is that they're not intended to predict any kind of performance on the end of your test. They are purely should be used as an instructional tool. And so one of the reasons for that is, a major reason, is that none of the items on the practice test have gone through the process that we put our operational items through. So there's no committee reviews, there's no field testing, there's no data review. It's purely a mirror or a mimic of what test items look like and how they function, how they're broken into sessions, the number of items or points for each session, but not about any kind of statistical information that you can gain about a student. So your best first step is to actually take the practice test yourself, and you can do this through Teacher Access. It will not record your responses, so you would need to keep track of that on your own. But while you do that, you should try to follow the time limit, use the testing materials that are provided. So for math, that would be like the math reference sheet if you're in grades 5 or up. And then to provide the actual, responses that you would think or expect should be included, especially for the written responses. So for today, what we're going to do is go through how to specifically support in using the practice test as an instructional tool. So, do's and don'ts, interpreting and using results, and then talk about some more logistical stuff like the practice test structure, timing recommendations, administering scoring, reporting. So first, we'll take a look at how to use the practice test from a content perspective. So you can use the practice test to examine your own instructional materials and strategies. So looking at how do these items align to the shifts or goals in instruction? How do these items require students to apply their content knowledge? How do these items help me understand the variety of ways that standards can be assessed? You can also use the content in here to compare to the purchased curriculum that your district uses or open source curriculum and assessments that your districts are using to help kind of guide selection of what you're using in terms of, rigor, approach, item variety. And then also you can examine the content and use the rubrics and scoring notes and scoring guides to better understand what sort of expectations are there for students' written responses, and that's across the board in all of our content areas. A really good use of the rubrics, scoring notes, and scoring guides is to plan regular collaborative scoring meetings with your colleagues. And I'll go through examples of each of these. So first, when we're looking at examining your instructional materials or strategies, the example we have here is for ELA. And I have a variety of examples from different content areas and different grade levels, just as whatever, examples kind of fit well here. And to keep it broad so it's not just focused on one thing or one content area, one grade level. And so this is a literary analysis task from the 7th grade practice test. And it goes into reading passages that are given, and then students are supposed to write from a first-person point of view, write an essay comparing the way that authors use the first-person point of view to develop characters. And so this can actually look at the strategies that, or help you look at the strategies that you're using to help students build that content knowledge and skills that they need in ELA. So it's not just about doing, having them write prompt after prompt after prompt response, but about building those skills so that when they get to a prompt, they have everything they need in their skill set to be able to apply it. So you can look at this from a perspective of, providing opportunities for all students to meet the grade level standards by putting in scaffolds and support. And examples can come from the Diverse Learner's Guide, or including a variety of instructional strategies. Again, we have a link to examples in this presentation, and this will be available also in the practice test library tomorrow, this presentation. And then focusing on the importance of discussion to help students make meaning of a text before they express their understanding in writing. An example of comparing to, in this case, open source materials this is an Algebra 1 item from the practice test. And so students are tasked to look at data that is not perfectly linear. It doesn't fit into a perfect model. And they are supposed to write an equation and use specific variables, and then explain how to use the equation for a specific value. The comparable lesson that I found, if you're using Eureka in their Algebra 1 Module 2 Lesson 2 Exploratory Challenge, students are asked to consider what a straight line, or if a straight line would be a good way to describe a relationship between an average number of clear days and elevation, and then explain why they would think this. So this would be a good way for them to dive into work that involves not using perfect numbers, because that's more real world. Examples of using rubrics and scoring notes and scoring guides. This one comes from Social Studies, grade 6 practice test. And so in the answer keys for Social Studies, there are annotated student responses. These are actual responses to the practice test items that we pulled. And we had teachers sit and score them, and then we annotated their the scores that they applied to these responses. So this particular response scored a 3 for content and a 3 for claims. And so if you're familiar with the social studies rubrics, you know that there are 2. There's 1 for content and 1 for claims. And then there are examples in the scoring notes of what that, what sort of things should be in the response content-wise. And so this one is highlighted to show student claims, course knowledge, and evidence from the sources. And then we see another example, and this one scored a 4 for each content and claims. And so if we compare them side by side, and what I did at the top here is I actually kind of combined the 2 parts of the rubric. So if it's got a superscript of 3 in front of it, that is the wording used to describe a 3. And then if it's got a superscript 4 in front of it, that's the wording to describe a 4. So the response on the left, using the claims rubric, scores a 3. The response on the right scores a 4. And I pulled out the relevant pieces from those responses on the previous slide to show how that fits in with the claims. So if you read through these examples, you can see that the one on the left shows they do develop a relevant claim. It does express general understanding of the topic. It supports the claim with sufficient evidence from the sources, and it's organized, and it makes connections and some patterns. The one on the right, however, which scores a 4 for claims, it's not only a relevant claim, it's valid. It is effective in its expression of solid understanding of the topic. So you know that the student who provided the response on the right really understands what they're talking about and have been able to synthesize the information to create this response. They have well-chosen evidence, and their organization is logical and in-depth when they are explaining the connections, patterns, and trends. If we look at the content rubric, same thing. Superscript 3 is a score of 3. Superscript 4 is a score of 4. On the left, we have the parts of the 3 response, the parts of the response that got a 3 for content that are relevant to content. And then on the right, we have the parts of the response that got a 4 for content. And so on the left, we can see that, again, it's a general knowledge specific to the Silk Road and how it affected economic and social development. It's got adequate factual information. It contains mostly accurate understandings, very minimal errors. Actually, this doesn't look like it contains very many errors at all. And certainly it addresses all parts of the prompt. For the answer on the right, there's much more thorough knowledge of the Silk Road and how it affected economic and social development. It is very focused in its information. It includes both information from the sources and their prior knowledge. Both actually present a good amount of prior knowledge here. And it's significant in its accuracy. So how do we not want the content used? Some of the things we think should be avoided is prioritizing content based on exactly what is in the practice test. There is no prioritization involved in building the practice test. It's about kind of availability and what we have developed. So if a standard is left off for some reason, and that reason is usually there's just too much to cover, it doesn't mean that it won't end up on the operational test. We certainly don't want teachers limiting their instructional strategies to just what they're seeing in the practice test. So, you know, you happen to see, you know, math, for example, multiple items involving, you know, tape diagrams. That doesn't mean you should focus your instructional strategy specifically to or overwhelmingly to tape diagrams. And we certainly would like to avoid teachers designing lessons solely around a specific set. So, for example, if you have a set of sources for an item set in social studies, that should not necessarily be the major focus for that content. You should consider spreading out and making sure that students are looking at a variety of sources. And then we have a list that we strongly discourage when using the practice test. Definitely not as a data gathering tool. It's not designed for that. We certainly discourage limiting stimuli, passages, sources, or context based on only what you're seeing on the practice test, because, you know, we're limited in what we can put in there. And then focusing on, we certainly want to discourage focusing on superficial concerns in student written responses. So, you know, in the other content areas besides ELA, we don't take into account, spelling and grammar errors or weird sentence structure or fragments, because, for math, they're getting graded on math. And for science, they're getting scored on their science content knowledge. And for social studies, the same. So, for ELA, we want to make sure that, it's not that when you're scoring it, you're not looking for, does this have exactly 4 paragraphs with an opening and 2 body paragraphs and 1 closing paragraph? It's really about what the student is saying in their response. We also want to make sure to discourage focusing only on the qualities of responses with the highest scores. Sometimes our best learning on our own is looking at our own mistakes. So looking at those scores that aren't perfect, that aren't the really high ones, that's where you can really see misunderstanding in student misunderstanding. That's where you can find great examples of student misunderstanding. So how can you use the practice test for practice with testing conditions? If you want to simulate some testing conditions, they're really great for facilitating testing discussions between teachers and students. You can discuss timing and pacing. That's always a concern for teachers, it's a concern for students. And those are discussions that need to be had. Discussing different item types. I would focus on looking at the difference between multiple choice and multiple select, and really, spending some time. Students should be well acquainted with multiple select by the time they get to that, even by the time they get to take the practice test, but certainly by the operational test. They want to you want them to look at elements of complete responses. Encourage students to answer all questions and complete all parts. And so when you're facilitating these discussions, not only is about, are they structural discussions about the test, but it should also be about student responses, especially for those written items. You can really see students pulling out different strategies. You can learn about student misconceptions, and other students can learn those issues as well and really grow in how they are expressing themselves and expressing their content knowledge, which is ultimately what we need them to do, is to effectively express their content knowledge. You can have students practice timing and pacing by setting some time limits on some tests and assignments. And then have students practice with the test mode. So if they're taking the online test, have them practice with typing and get familiar with it, using that shift key to reach, to use capital letters and other things that they might need to use, like the plus sign, if they don't want to use the equation builder for math. And you can also discuss strategic use of tools, like the equation builder, which is another tool that they're not required to use, but it is a handy tool that can help them out. If your school is having them take the paper-based test for grades 3 and 4 instead of the online test, again, discuss your strategic use of tools, using the highlighter, using scratch paper, or a protractor for math, grade 4. You can have them definitely practice bubbling their responses and writing within the response boxes, particularly, again, I'm going to highlight math because math is, what I know the best. Have them filling in those grids, practicing with those fill-in-the-blank grids for math. That's really important. And encourage students to list their skipped questions on scratch paper. Instead, because it used to be, they would have that separate answer document and they could just skip, although there were problems with that as well. But students forgetting to skip, mind you. But they would be able to see, if they skipped properly, where they didn't answer a question. That's a little bit harder when they're using a consumable test booklet, unless they're marking it some kind of way. So they have one reference point. So having them write it down on their scratch paper and list it can be really helpful so that they know which questions they need to go back to. So examples of how we'd like these used as far as simulating test conditions. This first example deals with facilitating those testing discussions between teachers and students. And so this is a science question from Science Practice Test. And it's got a part A and a part B. The part A is a technology enhanced item, so that in itself can facilitate some discussion. And for the sake of space, I just put what the answer looks like. In the boxes, the students see the boxes as empty. They would drag the molecule piece that fits to complete the molecule for each one. And so in this, they're looking at structure and pattern and what needs to fit to create this model. For part B, they then, this makes it dependent, they then need to answer which structural feature of the two molecules best explains the answer to part A. Now, this is a different type of discussion because this discussion is about content, where technically all the choices are factual statements. B is the only one that is going to explain part A. So in this case, this would make a great discussion on when you have correct statements as all your options, which is the piece of evidence that's going to support the response that was chosen in part A. Having students practice timing and pacing. So this is an ELA example. It says, as you work through all the parts of the writing process to build writing fluency, note the time needed for each part of the process. So not starting out by giving time limits, but actually starting out by seeing how long it's taking without any sort of time pressure. After students are successful with the entire process of writing, then consider the best approach for testing. If they're going to focus on sort of a general plan or evidence from tests. And then practice timed writing by administering one task from the practice test or from the guidebook to simulate testing conditions. Examples of having students practice with the test mode, again, math always stands out for me. This is a math example. This is an item from the practice test. And so looking at the right, you'll see the paper version, which has the grid, and they certainly need to practice with that grid. And then on the right of the grid is an entry box that they would experience. And so they need to know that they have a limit. It's 6 characters because there are only 6 boxes for them to enter in the grid, so it's the same. They can only put in numbers. So again, with the grid, they can only put in numbers. And then a decimal point. Again, with the grid, they can only put in decimal point for the numbers. So it limits in the same way that the grid limits. If they type other letters or symbols, they're going to get an invalid character entered message, like the one shown below. And they would just press OK, and they have to type something else. So if they're trying to type a $sign or they want to include the unit, they can't. And that's something they need to know before they get into testing. On the left-hand side, you'll see some gridding, what we call the gridding handout, which shows all the different ways that they can grid responses and all the different ways that they can't. And so some districts or school systems are very adamant that they only teach that very first way where students starts at the left and they only put in, they don't skip any spaces or anything like that. So certainly use what you think is best. But this can also be, peace of mind for yourself to see just all the ways that they can put those correct answers in and it scores correct. Now, just like there are ways that we think are good uses for testing conditions, there are ways that we think are not good uses. And so it is really strongly discouraged that we are overly focused on testing time, test prep, test taking strategies. The best test prep is teaching the content to the fidelity of the standards. We certainly don't want kids taking only timed assessments. Some, sure, but not all. We certainly don't encourage, we strongly discourage administering all the sessions within a single day. We don't even really encourage that during operational testing. We certainly don't want to see that when, you know, students are taking the practice test. And please, please do not alter classroom or school schedules to administer the practice test. This is not meant to be another test that the kids take. It is an instructional tool that can be done in pieces, and now legitimately can be done by session and scored by session. How would you use the practice test to look at format? You could notice that the questions are sequenced in meaningful ways to build understanding through structure or by scaffolding, and this is particularly true with passage sets and item sets in ELA, social studies, and science. You can incorporate set-based assessments like in science and social studies. That should not be the end-all be-all because there are standalone items on those tests as well, but students should become familiar with that format. And it is actually a lot easier to get into understanding and synthesizing sources and understanding and digging into scientific phenomena when it is a set-based type assessment or task. And then incorporate practice test items into instruction. So you can use this to review previously taught content, check for understanding of current content, expand discussions beyond just what's in it and the correct answers to how did you solve this? What did you do? How did you figure out what the evidence piece to this was? And so include skills and strategies for making those connections, and then incorporating the test materials or to look into the actual lessons. So examples of good sequencing, this is a social studies item and item set rather, and I basically took each question here to show how it builds. So the first question, and again, this is from 6th grade, starts with the actual motivation for using, for I guess, developing the Silk Road. I'm not sure that that's the right word, developing. And then the next 3 questions deal with response. How does China's response with paper money, or why does China respond with paper money? You know, the third question is specifically about the outcome of the growth of trade. So again, response. And then, you know, again, response of China, the Han Dynasty, by expanding the Silk Road. That last question is a CR question, and it is about, is an ER question, sorry, is about the effect. So looking at the sources, how the Silk Road affected the economic development and social development of Europe and Asia. So it builds into student understanding. So by the time they get to that ER, they've got things to pull from the previous questions to help them respond. Also, incorporate set-based assessment. So this is a sample science question. And so it shows the stimuli material. It is a very short phenomenon here with the Amazon River dolphins, giving the life cycle picture and then giving some description of how they live in groups and why that's good. This is a lower grade level, I believe it's 3rd or 4th grade. And then the questions, this is a part A and a part B question. No, it's not. Yes, it is. Where they answer the question. No, I'm sorry, this is a whole set. So the first question is about comparing the life cycle of the river dolphin to the life cycle of humans. And so we can see that that comes from figure 1. And then the next question comes from the bulleted list. And so it's about why they're living in groups, and the evidence is that they would protect each other. And so students would know that if you're watching for predators and you are trying to protect your group and then also protecting the young. Then for the next question, there's a part A and a part B. This is a 2-part. I got it right this time. And in this one, part A and part B, again, come from that figure 1. And so then the last question, which is a constructive response, that comes from the bulleted list again. So you can see that while each question relates to the stimuli materials that they're given, students still have to pull in their own knowledge. And so we can see that each question relates to a part of the stimulus. If you wanted to incorporate practice test items into instruction, one like this one, which comes from math test, obviously, and we're looking at an 8th grade item, it can be used in 2 ways. If you wanted to review previously taught content, you could separate each expression and have students simplify each expression and then try to solve for X. Or if you wanted to check for understanding of grade level content, you could have students write out the process for solving as a list of steps. Now, there is no right list, or there is no specific order that's correct necessarily. Students could actually go about creating this list starting in different ways, and then have students compare and critique each other's set of solving steps. They could, if you're going to use the test to incorporate online tools to practice into instruction, again, this is the equation builder, or this is actually the open response box for a math problem. And you can see the various ways that they can actually type into the box. So the first example is using only the keyboard and not using the equation builder, which is perfectly fine. Students are not penalized if they don't use the equation builder. Then the second one is a mix. They're using the keyboard and using the equation builder at the same time. And then the third one is a mix of keyboard buttons and the equation builder. And so all of these responses are correct, even though they look wildly different. And that's okay. We want students to become familiar with those online tools so they can type it the best way that works for them. So how do we not want format used? Please avoid making every classroom assignment and assessment mirror the practice test items set style design. There are still plenty of formative ways and non-formative ways to assess students without it looking like a standardized test. When using sets, CRs and ERs, we don't want those to be a sole measure of necessary content for each topic. There should be a variety of item types. So how do we, you say, you don't want me to use this as a data gathering tool. Well, then what do I do with the results of this? And so this section gets to that. Again, we start with some cautions. And really, this is about our experience. We've had practice tests for a few years now in over multiple content areas. And so these are sort of things that we've picked up over time in discussions with teachers and supervisors. Again, we want to stress it's not intended to predict student performance. It is not inclusive of all the content covered by the student standards. And please don't make assumptions about a student's score. We often get this question about, well, what percent is going to say, you know, I'm in the basic achievement level. There is no percent that does that. So using results, we say, look for patterns in student performance. Responses that are going to show they have gaps in content knowledge and skills. They have difficulty with items that require analysis of sources or stimuli. They select only one correct answer for multiple select items, difficulty analyzing and evaluating the context that they're given, or demonstrating their understanding of content knowledge. So they're having trouble expressing what they know. They're having an inability to complete sessions within the time allowed. And that, may be a case of a student needs extended time, or they need strategies on how to get things completed in the time allowed. And then, skipping of difficult questions. If, you see students are not returning or they're having a difficult time finding the skipped questions, there are discussions that you can have with students about that. The practice test guidance documents, which everything so far in this presentation is included in these practice test guidance documents, they can be really specific in the recommendations for individual content areas. So we have one specifically for social studies, one specifically for math, specifically ELA, and now a new one specifically for science. And so it can get into very content-specific patterns that you might look for and recommendations on how to adjust for those patterns that you find. So general practice test structure. For ELA, the practice test design is different than, for all of them, they're different than the operational design. Starting with ELA, the actual operational ELA test does not have 4 sessions, but the practice test does, because it contains all 3 writing tasks, even though we know that students will only do 2 of the 3 on the operational test. We still want them to have practice, or the opportunity to practice with all 3. Additionally, you'll see on the right column practice test timing, and this is different, slightly different than operational timing. So you'll see that the first 3 rows, the times are the same as you would see in the assessment guide, but for the 4th session, which remember there aren't really 4 sessions on the operational test, but this particular session on the ELA test that has the reading, literary, and informational text with the 2 reading passage sets, that also includes a field test passage set, which the practice test does not. None of the practice tests have field test questions. So we are recommending that for that session, you reduce the time by 30 minutes. So instead of an hour for grades 3 through 5, give them 30 minutes. If you want an accurate picture of how long, or if students are getting through it in the time allotted. For math, it depends on your grade, but the number of sessions and the way it's broken down is the same as the operational test, same as calculator and the components. But again, we make recommendations on the timing, because we have certain sessions that include field test CRs, constructed response items. And so for those sessions, which it's session 2 in grades 3 to 5, session 3 in grades 6 to 8, and session 1B in the high school tests, we would say reduce it by 15 minutes. So the actual time allotted for high school 1B is 55 minutes. We're saying if you want to time students, you should give them 40 minutes so that it's more accurate. Science practice tests, we're working on practice test timing at the moment because we are working on operational timing. Again, there will be field tests on the operational tests, so when we do update that, it will include adjustments for that. Now, social studies, if you haven't heard yet, the good news, we have looked at data for 2 years now with operational social studies tests and made some decisions based on not only that data, but feedback we've received from the field and whatnot, and have committed to reducing the actual tests. So for grades 3 and 4, their students are still going to need to apply their understandings of social studies and make connections. They're also going to get a report on the 5 achievement levels, so advanced, mastery, basic, approaching basic, unsat. And they're still going to get provided ratings on the 4 subcategories with the strong, moderate, weak. But the new design is going to reduce the number of sessions from 3 to 2. So students will only have 2 test sessions at grades 3 and 4 for social studies. This eliminates the extended response task set and one of the item sets. So there's less content to cover as well. This reduces the amount of time spent on the assessment by about 25%. So there are a few things you need to consider when looking at grades 3 and 4 for the practice test. The first table shows what the operational test will look like now, with just item sets and standalone items in each of the 2 sessions, and the time, students will have 75 minutes for each. But because this decision came recently and we wanted to have the practice test out sooner rather than later, we went based on the previous design, or some previous design changes we were considering actually. And so that's what the practice test looks like. So in all actuality, students don't need to take session 2 of the practice test because that's where that extra item set and task set are. But if teachers choose to administer this extra session and want to get some timing information, we would suggest that you time that at 60 minutes. For session 3, which now mirrors operational session 2, the operational session 2 includes an embedded field test item set. So practice tests don't include field tests anything. So we recommend reducing that time to 60 minutes to account for that, for not having that field test item set. For grades 5 through 8, again, we reduced by, and it's going to do the same things that it's done previously. The new design eliminates one of the item sets, and the 5 through 8 social studies assessments will not have embedded field test items at all. So instead of requiring all students in schools to participate in a field test, like we would have done, a sample of schools will participate in a shortened field test that's going to be outside the testing window. Nope, sorry, during the existing testing window, but it's not going to be a part of the test. It's not embedded in the test. And then, so if we want to compare operational versus practice test, so it's still going to have 3 sessions, and the 3 sessions still contain the same things, except that first session, we took out, or we're taking out, an item set in the operational test. And so for grade 5, instead of 65 minutes for the operational, you would actually add some time because there's an extra item set in there that's not going to be on the operational test. So we're saying add about 10 minutes. And the same for 6 to 8, add about 10 minutes. So instead of giving them 85 minutes, you give them 95 minutes. And then sessions 2 and 3 are comparable to what they're going to see on the operational test for the most part. And so 65 minutes is appropriate to continue to give them. For U.S. history, it's slightly different. The operational test, session 3 is split into 2 parts, where there's a task set and then item sets and standalone. And so the timing is split into 45 minutes and 60 minutes. The practice test does not have the extra task set And so we say just time session 3 at 60 minutes. Now, what I don't want, or what we don't want, is a misconception that 3A is the field test task set. It will be spiraled between session 2 and 3A. So you won't, in effect, you won't know which one is the field test task set in the operational test. Again, this doesn't exist in the practice test. There's no field testing in the practice test. So administering and scoring. The practice test quick start guide breaks down how to access the practice test, teacher access and student access, gives links to guidance documents, helps you prepare for online administration, scoring, and accessing reports. And so the next few slides give us sort of a checklist of where you can find stuff, because we realize we have stuff in multiple places. So the computer-based practice test is only in Insight. The paper-based practice test for grades 3 and 4 is in the practice test library and in eDirect. And you can see where each thing is. So again, for more materials, where they're located, and you'll see that some of them are located in multiple places, and that's, that can be helpful. And then this table is about general scoring information. So the practice test, most of it is computer scored. So that's your selective response, evidence-based selective response, technology enhanced short answer. But for the ones where students have to compose a response, so constructive response or extended response, teachers have to score those. To use eDirect for educator scoring, you would log into eDirect and choose all applications. You can follow the directions on the screen, or you can use the eDirect user guide, which also provides screenshots and step-by-step directions for using educator scoring. Now, if you log into eDirect and you don't have access, then you need to talk to your school test coordinator. Additionally, if you're in eDirect and you can't find something, it's likely that you, for whatever reason, don't have access to it, and you would, again, need to talk to your school test coordinator. So in printing student responses, and we must stress that if you want printed responses, you have to do it before you start the educator scoring. So that's why this is first, the printing as opposed to the scoring. So you would follow the steps here, which again, I've included pictures, and you can either print by all students or print for specific students. And then once you've printed, if you want to print, which we recommend, then you can score the responses in the system. Okay? And so this breaks it down how to score for specific students, or how to score all students in a test session. Once you're actually in there to score, what you see on the right is actually what you would see on your screen on the left in educator scoring. And so it breaks down into steps what you would need to do. So first you would apply the score, and this is for a 2-point Algebra 1 item. Or this part is 2 points. And then you would submit the score, and then it will automatically bring you to the next constructive response. And then when you're done with all the available responses, it's going to prompt you to log out. You can exit at any time by clicking the exit scoring icon at the bottom, button at the bottom. So with scoring responses, just a few notes to think about. The rubrics and scoring guides are in the answer keys, which are the chart on previous slides can tell you where you can find all the answer keys. DRC Insight does not need to be installed for scoring. You need a computer or a laptop with Chrome or Internet Explorer 11. Teachers can put comments. So if we look at the previous slide, there is a section where you can put in comments in the scoring notes. And then student responses can be batch printed, which is a new feature, again, before you start scoring. And then teachers can access student responses using the student lookup feature. Collaborative scoring is one of the best ways to help grow not only teacher understanding of student expectations for their written responses to constructed response and extended response items, but also a great way for students to understand what they're not providing compared to what they should be providing. So the scoring activity is in all of the practice test guidance documents, and it's slightly adapted to each content area, but not by much because the process is basically the same for each content area. But you'll establish common expectations for student writing, learn to use a writing rubric and identify qualities of writing that meet standards, reveal grade-specific expectations in a school, and then you can also learn about and discuss different approaches that can improve instruction. For accessing reports, again, this is available, all this information is available in the eDirect user guide. This shows an example of a student response map, and so you can see the types of information you would find. This is an ELA item response map. Again, to stress that practice tests are not designed to provide summary data. So in that case, the column shown with total percent earned is actually empty for the practice test, which is different than the interim and diagnostic tests. So that takes us to our next step. You should definitely access that practice test quick start guide and access and use the practice test guidance document that pertains to the content area that you teach or multiple content areas that you teach, if that happens to be the case. Share these resources and materials, and then encourage your colleagues to view the practice test webinar, which will be it is recorded. It'll be posted to the practice test library. It usually takes us about a week to get it up there. If you have any questions, please email assessment@la.gov. And I'm going to pause for just a second to check to see if we've gotten some questions throughout the webinar. Hold, please. All right, so the only question we have is that will there be a digital copy of this PowerPoint? And yes, there will. It will be available in the practice test library tomorrow. If you have any questions that come up later through the process at any time, please email assessment@la.gov. We'd love to talk to you about how you're using the practice test. And we're also interested in seeing how it's being used ourselves. So thank you so much for joining me. Have a great afternoon.